Shameen, you're very welcome to the ScaleX Insider podcast. I'm really delighted and thrilled to be speaking with you today.
Thank you so much, Brendan.
Yeah, and even more appreciated because I know it's late at night with you in Shanghai. So once again, thank you. We were speaking off air. I mean, you know, our vision is to inspire, connect, and enable millions of small and medium-sized enterprises to scale with purpose. So let's kick off. What does scaling with purpose mean to you, Shameen?
Well, it's such a pleasure to join you on this conversation. And I think what you're doing is just tremendously valuable. When I was a doctoral student, I was actually looking at how small and medium-sized companies internationalize. And, that's basically about growth and basically about scaling. And the way I see it, scaling is about growth that is disproportionate to a rise in headcount. In other words, if I had 10 people and made €1 million and then hired another 20 people and then made €2 million, that would be growth, but that's not scaling. So the way I see it, scaling is disproportionate growth. And I think, of course, what is very important in this is the business model and the logic for value creation. And this term business model, when I was studying at Strathclyde Business School in Glasgow in the late 1990s, and then joined an internet startup, people started asking me, so what's your internet startup's business model? And no one had mentioned the term in business school. And I think it is not a coincidence that the internet 1.0 gave rise to this idea of the business model. Actually, companies have had a business model long before the term was used, but the internet helped startups to scale in a way that had not been possible before. Amazon selling books to people like us, the product, the market unchanged, but the business model allowed disproportionate growth, or growth that was disproportionate to the rise of employee headcount because the internet could create. So that's the scaling part. But I just love the way you frame this as scaling with purpose, because that goes beyond, right? It's about, so if a business model is at its core about value creation to customers, I think what purpose does is place that in a broader societal context. The most cliched example of this being, the janitor at NASA, who when asked what he was doing said, I'm helping put a man on the moon, is basically to then think about, well, where is this value creation piece part of a broader societal challenge? So that's long answer to a short question, but that's my take on scaling with purpose.
Yeah, I love it, by the way. And we're almost at our 100th episode, and I've never heard it couched like that. And I know the with purpose perspective is very important to you. For those listening, you'll not be able to obviously see what's behind Shameen, which is the wonderful collage of the UN, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we'll get into that a little later. I want to congratulate you on your wonderful book. I have a copy here, holding it up, Gorillas Can Dance. And I would really like to do a masterclass on Gorillas Can Dance for our audience today. But before we get into that, as someone who can resonate with the work that goes into writing a book, this is really instructive. It's heavily researched. It's leaning on 15 years of your own experience to bring this book to the fore. We agonized over the title of our book, which in the end up, it was very straightforward, Simple Scaling, which is our company name. Gorillas Can Dance is a wonderful name. Can you give the background to the title of the book, Shameen?
So, as I said, the work I did as a PhD student in Scotland was about how small companies go international. And one of the things I observed was that some of them were talking to large multinationals. So, for example, for many years, Scotland had these American companies set up subsidiaries, and I observed a few local Scottish SMEs, and many of them a subset of these, which were sort of very young entrepreneurial ventures, trying to make connections with, say, Sun Microsystems in Linlithgow, or IBM in Greenock, in the hope that they could then expand that relationship maybe to the United States and help them grow. And so I just finished my PhD. I was at my first academic conference with a DR, doctor title, before my name. So that's always sort of, it's like a rite of passage, I guess. And I mustered up the courage to ask this famous strategy professor if he thought it would make sense for me at that very early stage in my academic career to start looking at how small companies partner with large multinationals. And his response was, in my view, many of these smaller companies have no choice but to learn to dance with the big gorilla. And I just latched onto that. And so it was a piece that I wrote a couple of years later with Julian Birkinshaw of London Business School, who has been a tremendous mentor to me, called Dancing with Gorillas, which was probably the first thing I wrote that captured attention. But that was from the point of view of the smaller company. And that's, of course, your core audience that we're talking to today. But then over time, I also started to notice that some of the gorillas were making a concerted effort to systematically partner with startups. And so the book, which is written to a large company audience, became titled Gorillas Can Dance.
Yeah, I love it. I absolutely love it. And it speaks directly to the 9th principle from our 10 principle ScaleX framework, which is partnerships. And I assert that when small and medium-sized enterprise leaders can find and leverage those gorillas and partner with those gorillas effectively, then they will accelerate their scaling ambition. So in that context, I would like us, as I mentioned, to do a little masterclass today. And your book's wonderfully laid out in a very clear way of the why, the how, and the where. So let's kick off. Why should SMEs seek to partner with the gorillas, with the larger corporations?
I think the simple answer to the why is the prospect of a win-win. And that stems from the fact that each side has something that the other wants. So smaller companies typically have agility. Large companies have scale. So I think one of the important things for smaller companies to understand is the big companies need more help than they let on sometimes, and I think from their point of view, they're facing a fast-moving environment, and they have become very good at operating efficiently at scale, but it isn't easy to turn on a dime in the way that smaller companies can. And that's where small companies can be of use to them. So I think part of the why from the small company's point of view is to recognize, well, they can make a difference. And B, in so doing, they can potentially benefit from the scale of the big company, which can have at least 3 important benefits. One is legitimacy. There is, by being associated with a highly reputed firm that can make a difference, it can help to open doors to other opportunities. And then there are potential learning outcomes. And then there are business leads, because when you're dealing with a big company, and if it goes well, you're dealing with a wide network, which can, generate business opportunity. So I think that's the basic sort of rationale. It's the prospect of a win-win, and that stems from the complementarity. All that being said, I also need to add, in case it's sounding too good to be true, that with that very complementarity, which is predicated on major differences between the two sets of firms, comes a major challenge. The very differences that make it attractive to work together also makes it difficult, or at least not straightforward, to work together.
We're going to get into some of those challenges, just poking at the why a little bit more. You mentioned agility. When I'm coaching and supporting SME leaders, either on a one-to-one basis or through our program, they often undervalue their core skill sets, which is that agility, which is that adaptability, which is that entrepreneurialism. It's that kind of get up and go attitude. Must do is a great master. Creativity. It's all of those things, but they don't necessarily value those things. What happens in the larger corporate? I suppose it's important for you to share with the listeners your experience of the larger corporates and what they lose often when they get to the size of a gorilla that they now seek to find in the SMEs. And in that basis, it's important for SMEs to, I suppose, stick their chest out a little bit in the metaphor of the gorilla and actually be able to promote the value that they do bring, but often it's value that they overlook.
I think you're absolutely right. Small companies need to have a healthy dose of self-esteem. And what they must recognize is that the major challenge for organizations, if you had to pick one, is the tension between exploitation and exploration. And these are two terms with very specific meanings. This was coined by the late James March at Stanford University. Exploitation, it isn't doing bad things to people. It's about using the resources and capabilities that the organization already has. Exploration, on the other hand, is the building of new ones. And basically, what makes you successful today doesn't necessarily make you successful tomorrow, especially when the business environment changes or there is a new entrant. I mean, how many of us could have predicted that Nokia, which at one point was so dominant in the mobile handset, the mobile phone business, that they were in the top 3 in terms of market share in all the advanced markets and all the emerging markets. There were very few companies that were that dominant. How many of us would have guessed that they would lose massive market share to a company which at one, used to be called something computer, right? Apple dropped the name computer at one point. Or who would have thought that large automotive giants like General Motors and Ford and so on would one day be, desperately anxious about what was at one point a startup called Tesla. And so all of this speaks to the problem of disruption, which makes it important to do exploration alongside the exploitation. But while everybody knows that in their heads, the reality is there are such strong short-term pressures, for example, quarterly profits and so on, that the exploration gets crowded out, and most people focus on the exploitation because that's what they are incentivized to do. And there's no harm in that because, in fact, you need to be good at that, and that's what makes a company profitable. But I mean, think of Microsoft that was so dominant in the PC era, so much so that you had both Microsoft and Intel, in fact, who were jointly referred to as Wintel, right? And then just to go back to that example of Apple, it wasn't just Nokia that struggled with the rise of the mobile internet. Intel missed out on that, and Microsoft were viewed as a one-trick pony, so much so that under Steve Ballmer, even though they were so profitable, the share price didn't go. All of that is to say that small companies should recognize that big companies that are impressive and doing very well may also have in that success the seeds of future failure because of the inability to adapt quickly enough and change for a new environment because of new technologies, new customer needs, new government regulations, new competition. The small companies, on the other hand, tend to, be much more attentive to, sensitive to these changes, usually has leadership who are able to be decisive, fewer layers to work through, and therefore in a position to add value to companies that are exploration light, shall we say.
Yeah. Your book focuses heavily on Microsoft, and you mentioned Steve Ballmer there. What happened when Satya Nadella came to the CEO role in the context of his mindset and how he viewed SMEs and the potential of SMEs to change the trajectory of Microsoft?
That's a great question. And as is often the case, I think the story starts somewhat earlier in time than when it sort of becomes visible to the public. So Satya Nadella became CEO of Microsoft in 2014. And the company was at that point about 4 decades in existence. And he was only the third CEO.
Yeah.
So there'd been Bill Gates, who was a co-founder, really the dominant founder, Steve Ballmer, who had sort of near founder status. And then all of a sudden, this guy who a lot of people hadn't even heard of. But I was lucky in that in 2011, I attended the Worldwide Partner Conference of Microsoft because I was interested to track some startups that had begun working with them, and they were given a booth to sort of gain some visibility there. And this newly appointed president of the Server and Tools division, Satya Nadella, stands up and gives a speech about how cloud computing is the future. And that was a big statement to make in a company that was making most of its money through the Windows operating system in a PC era company. But he was so sure that that was going to be the future of the company. And cloud computing was a game changer for small companies because this dramatically reduced the need for huge fixed costs in IT infrastructure and so on. And I think he became aware that now these smaller companies were going to be strategically important to Microsoft. So fast forward 3 years, 2014, he comes along. He is now determined to take cloud computing, take that from the periphery to the mainstream. But hey, that also meant that engagement with these smaller entrepreneurial companies now became extremely relevant to the direction of the company. And so I think he basically recognized the essence of what we're saying, that there is this complementarity. And one way to think about this, and I must credit this term to Professor Peter Buckley at Leeds University, he said when he heard about my work and was commenting about this, he said, it seems to me that there are different types of entrepreneurship in the large company and the smaller company. And so there's a division of entrepreneurial labor that comes into play if they manage to work together. And you go back to the distinction between exploitation and exploration. And of course, the big company also needs to do exploration, and smaller companies can feed into that too. But just to take a very basic view, what the potential for collaboration between a smaller company and a big company does is, at a very basic level, allows the big company to do what it's good at, its exploitation, and combine the efforts of the smaller company, which may be far more adept at exploration, in a way that both achieve more than what either could have done alone.
You've used the term exploitation, and I know it's not in this context, but it's a nice segue into the how. How does the SME, given that metaphor of dancing with gorillas, how can the SMEs manage that power dynamic? Having, being a CEO of a small business, we grew into a medium-sized business, then a large business. I've been in that business when it was 15 people and then 700 people across 6 continents. And I remember, and I recall vividly as a small company on the outside looking into these much larger companies, having tried to partner with them at different stages, feeling that certainly we were exploited at different times, but in more so than not, actually, we were irrelevant. Whilst there was an initial attraction, we couldn't get any traction within the company, the gorilla themselves. But how do we make sure that when we're coming to partnering, which suggests we're bringing something of equal value, that as an SME we don't get exploited in the process?
Indeed. So yes, that is extremely important. And I think part of the reason why that term dancing with gorillas resonated with people is because of the hint of danger. You could get trampled if you're dancing with a gorilla. Others have used the term swimming with sharks, which has the same sort of idea. So I think when you look at it from the point of view of the smaller company, it's important to hold two contradictory ideas in one's head. And that's the need to be, on the one hand, optimistic, positive, put your best foot forward, and at the same time, be cautious and wary and careful. And I see this playing out throughout the relationship building process. So I see this as a process rather than an event. And I think the first thing to do is, when there is recognition of a potential win-win, the smaller company, so to form the relationship on a positive note, has to be very proactive. And to form that initial link, being proactive could mean, in certain contexts, using local government allies. That was certainly the case in Scotland, where Scottish Enterprise did things. I remember going to a Microsoft event and seeing Enterprise Ireland had a booth where they brought smaller companies. And in fact, this is very relevant in some parts of Asia, like China, where again, local government entities are important. But in other cases, it could be local accelerators. It could be just using your networks to find a way to be proactive and put yourself out there. But at the same time, and this is the be very careful side of things, ascertain that the big company is serious about this. And there is no foolproof way of doing this that I know. But I think one can do one's homework. First of all, don't get carried away when the big company is showing interest, and try to understand where the strategic priorities of the company truly lie. And again, this is where doing one's homework, certain amount of intelligence helps. And the key is sort of follow the money. Where is the big company investing at the moment, irrespective of what they say or not? So for example, if you're a smaller company in Israel, with expertise in certain, let's say, cybersecurity, I'm using that because Israel is well known for that, and you hear BMW is interested, and you do some research and you figure out, hey, cybersecurity is going to be extremely important to the strategic direction of the company, then, prima facie, you could at least initially assume that it is plausible that they're interested. So that's at the forming stage. And so I think it's very important to be as sure as one can possibly be. Yeah. But then the next step is sort of to consolidate the relationship. And what I mean by that is working on let's say, a joint project, or doing the first important joint thing. And once again, it's important to put one's best foot forward. Although here, what I would say about being proactive and, again, seeking that opportunity is to make sure that the smaller company is accepting an opportunity that is directly aligned with their core strength. Because most small companies are very good at a small number of things, maybe one thing. And sometimes it transpires that you speak to a big company and they say, you know what, you're an interesting company. We aren't quite moving as fast as we'd like to in your area of expertise, but we do have this other thing which is sort of maybe of tangential interest to you. Would you be interested? And the temptation often is, hey, let's do something to get our foot in the door. Mm. I like that kind of thinking. I think there's a place for it, particularly early on in the forming state, when you're trying to get yourself on the radar.
Almost like a tryout,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But when it comes to something much more substantial, where you actually get to work together on something, you just need to wait till there's something that's in your sort of hitting arc. You've got to do, because you get exactly one chance to make a good first impression, and it's got to be in that area. So part of the wisdom here is letting go of tangential opportunities, however painful that is. But that's all to say, be positive, put your best foot forward, and position yourself with confidence in that area that you're extremely strong at. But at the same time, and this is the part about being wary of the big gorilla, don't give away all the information and knowledge immediately. Break the project down into milestones so that the knowledge transfer is modularized, if you will. Because the challenge for the small companies to show enough of what they know to be of interest to the big company, but not so much that they're not needed anymore. And nobody should assume, that they won't be taken advantage of.
Yeah, I think there's so much great advice in there in terms of doing your due diligence up front, leveraging the power of the local government enterprise vehicles. We certainly would have done that with Invest Northern Ireland, which was the Northern Ireland equivalent of Enterprise Ireland.
Enterprise Ireland,
yeah.
Right.
So the understanding of the bigger companies, the gorillas in the current investment strategy in terms of follow the money, I think that's wonderful advice. And really, the word of caution here is not to get carried away with unbridled excitement, where you're just going to, drop the trousers immediately here. It's having those marked milestones where you're transferring knowledge along the way. That brilliant advice. Something very practical here. I've had recent experience with a company, and this company is on the brink of a partnership with Amazon. Amazon are going to potentially become a customer of that company. But what Amazon do, actually, and I wasn't aware of this, they take a percentage of the equity in the company initially and have the right or option or warrant to take a larger percentage should the company exit in the future. Now, how on the basis that they say, well, as soon as we become a customer, your value is going to go up, and we want to share on that upside. How does the company founder of the SME weigh this up? Because on the one hand, you've got this huge gorilla, and on the other hand, they want a share of your sweat, blood, and tears by way of a fairly sizable chunk.
There is this dilemma that founders have, which a professor called Noam Wasserman describes as the choice between being rich or being king or queen, right? It's the trade-off between control, which you have more of when you give away less equity or if you don't give any equity away, versus the prospect of growth when you give equity away, and that brings with it certain resources and so on. But when you share, you share. And especially companies like the one you just mentioned, any involvement on the equity side, whether it leads to then having a presence on the board of directors or not, but I would imagine that would very much be on the cards, will mean that your destiny is not entirely in your hands anymore, but the scope for growth could be great. And so I think, and this is very much down to founders' own sort of personal inclination about these things. But I think this is one of those areas where there's a trade-off. There are some things where I think you have to hold contradictory ideas in your head, like what we were talking about, being on the one hand positive, optimistic, and on the other hand, at the back of your mind thinking, if they could, they would crush us. There's that. I think there are other contexts in which it makes more sense to think in terms of trade-offs. And here, I think you need to accept the trade-off. There are very few cases where you have very little equity as a founder and still have sort of huge control. And these are the kinds of people that most people think of when you say the word entrepreneur. They'll say Steve Jobs, or they'll say Jack Ma. And these are the outliers who, even when their equity stake was very low, still had, huge influence within the company. But most, mortals will have the situation where, you're making that trade-off. And so I think, but that becomes a very individual choice. And some people are comfortable with that trade-off in the end, maybe not delighted about it, but they can make their peace with it. And others can't. And if control is much more important, then I think that's important to recognize, to at least have that self-awareness and intellectual honesty with oneself.
Yes, and this really is a question of mindset, and it's something we'll come to. I feel if you're of the mind to create an organizational vision and an organizational ambition that ultimately will outlast you, then the decision should be one of what's best to propel the organizational vision. Of course, there has to be compensation for the efforts that have been invested to get to this point from a founder's perspective and the leadership team, the wider team. But ultimately, if you're truly scaling with purpose, if you feel that this gorilla is going to take you into a new sector, a new region, or many new sectors, many new regions, then it's discerning whether that trumps any personal agenda for you to maintain control. So for me, it's a question of mindset. You raise that point of being able to hold these two contradictory, these opposing views in the same place, and it's a trait that's often ascribed to Leonardo da Vinci, who is hailed as the greatest genius that ever lived. One of the 7 traits, the Italian word for this is sfumato, and I love this, and I think it's an important point for all leaders, that you must be able to hold opposing views in the same place and then discern what is the right way forward in the betterment of the organization in terms of going forward in this marriage with the gorilla. So thank you for that, Shameen. Anything else on the how in terms of the practicalities, and maybe is there anything on the legal side of things that SME leaders should be aware of whenever they're getting to the pointy end of business here and signing contracts? Is there anything specifically you would caution our listeners to be aware of as they go into this marriage?
Right. So I'll come to the legal issue in just a moment, but let me just add this then. If in the example you gave, the founder is actually very committed to this organization growing and scaling, and is therefore willing to take the support of this particular large company, I would still say that then they should be very positive, optimistic, and then move forward with vigor. So the key there would be then to tap into the wider network of that big company, because that is where you really get your bang for your buck. And that really is the scaling side of things. It's when the small company in Glasgow starts working with Sun Microsystems in Linlithgow, and then works with them also in California, and then works with them somewhere else. That's the magic. At the same time, what the small company needs to do is to build options for future growth and not assume that this will necessarily be the one major gorilla that they're going to dance with. So from that point of view, the marriage metaphor breaks down a little bit. We're not assuming exclusivity or permanence here, and especially as you scale. But what could work very well is if you take your learnings in terms of how to have gone from that initial consolidation of the relationship to this extension, and potentially apply it to other big companies too. Because today it may make sense to work with Gorilla X, but then the world changes and it may make sense to work with Gorilla Y. And hey, you need to realize that they're thinking like that a lot more than you are, because they're probably thinking, well, it's great for us to dance with small company A today. And, a year or two from now, if they're not the hottest game in town, we'll go on to small company B. And, in that sense, they in fact have more options. So I think it's perfectly necessary, it's perfectly okay to have that sort of dual mindset. Now, coming back to your question about the specifics, and I think that becomes especially important when you go from forming the relationship to consolidating the relationship. I have 2 views on this. One, again, from the point of view of being cautious, it's, I think, useful to take legal advice. I'm sure Northern Ireland Enterprise, those kinds of organizations, I know Scottish Enterprise were pretty good when smaller companies approached, when I was doing research there, to help on this dimension. The main thing is to factor in the bargaining power and to think about who owns the intellectual property that results from joint activity. And I think small companies should be careful not to sell themselves short. That being said, let me tell you also something very interesting I've observed with not every, but a growing number of big companies. Some big companies have taken the view that they are actually competing for the hearts and minds of the best talent amongst the smaller companies. And they should make life as smooth and easy as possible. So smaller companies should be as discerning as they can to try and find these companies that have also sort of endeavored to make a reputation for themselves as a good partner of smaller companies. And some of them have actually decided that the best way to do this is to say, any IP that's developed belongs to you guys, especially when it's in an area that is not core to the big company, but they're working with a very complementary technology. So to go back to the example of, say, an automotive company that is realizing the need to improve some of the features of cybersecurity or autonomous driving or so on, they may well have come to a view, and I know some specific examples where this is the case, where they're saying, let the IP stay with the smaller company. And they're doing this not only to be able to attract the brightest and best, it's also because some of them have got advice from their legal teams that says it's actually much simpler and a lot more hassle-free from our perspective as well.
Yeah, great advice. Before we move on to the where, anything else that we should address in the how? And allied to that, what are some of the red flags SME leaders should be aware of to, I suppose, warn them that this may not be the best partner?
Okay, so I think what I would say is what small companies should do is to understand where the big companies are coming from so that they can then direct their efforts in forming, consolidating, and extending the relationship better. And so what I have observed among the big companies that are, taking this idea of partnering with smaller entrepreneurial firms seriously is they've recognized the problem that we talked about earlier, which is you have this paradox. The very differences that make it attractive to work together also makes it a challenge to work together. So they seem to be unpacking, consciously or unconsciously, what those differences are, and then trying to address them. And so one major issue is there's a asymmetry of goals. They're very, the big company, small company want different things at different time scales. To address which, what big companies do is they clarify what the synergy is. Everybody talks about win-win. Well, here's what the win-win looks like. It could be, we have building blocks that we want you to build on top of, and then we could potentially co-sell solutions. That's the Microsofts of the world. Or it could be, we have pain points and we want you, clever small company, to help us solve this. That's the BMWs of the world. Understanding this helps a small company in the forming stage, especially, put your best foot forward and so on. It's the better you understand the synergy, the better you can pitch. And then another area of asymmetry is asymmetry of structure. When two big companies talk to each other, the vice president of marketing of one can easily find their counterpart. Not so easy for smaller companies where the structures are flatter, where people wear multiple hats. So big companies that are taking this sort of stuff seriously create interfaces, an identifiable port of call that small companies can go to. These might be sort of like funnels where they screen out potential partners till they find the one or few that can address whatever challenges they have. Or it could be more of a cohort style, we have an accelerator program type of thing. But again, understanding the nature of the interface and what's going on there helps very much in terms of consolidating the relationship. And then finally, and this is actually what I find distinguishes the companies that take it truly seriously from the others, is they actively try to cultivate exemplars, success stories, relatively early on, because that addresses the asymmetry of attention, which is to say, big companies see an ocean of smaller companies out there, and they don't know which ones are worthy of their limited managerial attention. The smaller companies, they know who the big companies are, but they don't know whose attention within the big company to try and attract. And when you have these exemplars, you see what success looks like. And then both sides can sort of have a better idea of what success looks like, and where to prioritize your attempts to attract attention. Because this is one of the big insights that I've gained. A lot of this comes down to how people allocate their scarce attention. And the power asymmetry makes it such that from the smaller companies' point of view, they're sort of going uphill a bit more. And so paying attention to what else has happened in the company to the extent possible helps them to then figure out who to prioritize their attention to. So the red flags are when you see that a big company has pulled the plug, in the middle of a partnership with a smaller company, and that could be maybe because they were dealing with the subsidiary of a American company in Belfast, and maybe it was the headquarters in the US that changed its mind, but still it's a smaller company that suffers the most, right? Yeah. So observing this can help, but that then exemplifies why it's important to break down the knowledge transfer process, because if you did that smartly, even if the project ended abruptly, you could potentially have something to show for your efforts, like a initial prototype or something, which you then take to another gorilla or just complete yourself. And so I think being very mindful of making sure, because I've seen a case where there was one gorilla and two different small companies. One of them was engaged in a much more open-ended discussion, and it went on for 3 months. And then the big companies started sort of going a bit cold. And then within 6 months, they said, you know what, our priorities have changed. Same big company, exact same time, another small company used those first 3 months to create a prototype. And then when things started going south, they still had something that they could then work with another collaborator. In fact, another SME. At this point, they then didn't feel they needed to go to another gorilla. So, yeah.
Great advice. Again, really, really practical. And what I'm hearing is the importance of, from an SME leader's perspective, put your mindset such that you're standing in the shoes of the leader of the gorilla,
Exactly.
And just reframe how you're thinking in the context of how they're thinking. I think leading from that, something that I was always reluctant to do is ask up front, what's in it for you? You're the big guys. We knew what was in it for us because it was all of those things of accelerating our footprint in these new geographic regions. But we could never see what was in it for them. But we were afraid to ask the question in case they would discover that, oh, actually, we haven't really thought this through. There's nothing in it for us. But ultimately, they're going to discover that somewhere down the track. We had invested all of this effort, and eventually they did discover that there wasn't really that much in it for them. Asking that question up front, I feel, is so important. The examination, I really love that. The examination of existing exemplars, existing case studies in this gorilla's life story, in terms of them being able to show you company A, company B, company C partnerships, and how they've evolved and how they've made a success of these partnerships. And one that you called out in the book is how Microsoft partnered with Azure at the time to accelerate their foothold in the cloud computing world. And on that note, before we get into the where, how do we, using that case study, how do we ensure that we don't get lost inside the big company? You know, what things should be there in place? What should we be, you know, if we're going into these for the first time, what should this dance feel like? And if it's not feeling like that, then we realize, oh no, this isn't as it should be. So what should be existent in those relationships for us to look out for?
No, that's a great question. And by the way, I really like what you said about, you know, having the courage to ask up front, and I can fully understand why one might be reluctant. But I think what's important to realize is, as time has passed, big companies have been, some of them at least, have been forced to eat humble pie. They recognize that it's important to collaborate more and be perceived to be desirable partners. And so I think things have also changed. I mean, it would be perfectly understandable to adopt the stance that you described not that long ago. But I think we're also at a point in time where I'm reasonably optimistic that there are a reasonable number of gorillas that are worth talking to. And so one can be more emboldened now. So going back to the question, I think, you know, one of the things that so when I wrote the book and sent the draft to a few people for comments and, you know, quotes, one person sent me a lovely quote, which is included in the book, but then very sort of in a very gentle way kind of offered me a small criticism and said, you know, you have so many of these examples, but you also mentioned the names of so many individuals. And, you know, I think I'm not sure that that's so necessary. And I was thrilled, because it made me realize that one of the things I had managed to do was to show something that I truly believe is important. We talk about big companies and small companies partnering, but in fact, it is people within each company that are engaging with each other, right?
Yeah, of course.
And I think one of the things I am very proud about what I've done is I have sort of highlighted the people inside the big company, and for sure the entrepreneur within the startups who are in fact working with each other. And interestingly, in the big company, and this is part of the structure asymmetry, it's often middle managers who are engaged in collaboration with the smaller company. I mean, sometimes they have fancy titles and so on, but it's not like the entrepreneur of a small company is dealing with Satya Nadella at Microsoft, right? They're dealing with a division manager, they have a nice enough title, and of course they are empowered to do whatever they do. But look, these are middle managers typically. And I think one of the key things when you're going into this is to look out for the people. And especially in terms of consolidating the relationship and then extending the relationship, it comes down to how the smaller companies' leaders engage with managers in the big company. And here there's a bit of a tension, because you sometimes deal with somebody today for about 6 months and then you hear they're moving on. And that can be frustrating, but that can be your ally for the next project in this other division.
Yeah.
Or even if they move to another company, that could still be your ally. But at the same time, you also need to keep multiplying that portfolio of individuals that you're engaging with within the company. And look out for the people in two respects. One is what they are being incentivized to do, what are their KPIs, and some of the most effective small company leaders I have come across who engage with big companies not only ask the question that you raised earlier, which is what is in it for you as a company, but also tell me what your KPIs are. Because that then helps you to, well, maybe gauge whether you should be going ahead with this or not, but also then making sure that the people you're dealing with are better off because of this relationship. And then they end up becoming your biggest champion within the firm. And that, by the way, is what I discovered as an academic too. Because why should Microsoft have spoken to a guy based in Glasgow with a PhD from Strathclyde University, which I'm extremely proud of. But that's not the same as rolling up to an event in America and saying I have a PhD at Stanford or a PhD at Harvard. And it was the people within Microsoft who, for whatever reason, saw my sincerity or saw that I was building up a track record of work on this topic, who would then, help me to find the next level of access and the next level of access and become my internal champions. Because in a way, I was a startup academic, 15 years ago.
Of course.
With the audacity to try to engage with some of these bigger companies. And so I think that's one of the key broad principles to recognize. It comes down to the people.
Yeah, it's wonderful advice. And just to kind of wrap that up, and why I feel it's important to ask that question at the outset in terms of the what's in it for them. Money comes and goes, time just goes. So it's really important right at the outset to get a level of surety, an increased sense of probability that the investment of your time is going to lead to something that's valuable for all parties, and importantly, the customers that you're seeking to serve here in the context of scaling with purpose. The second part is so important in terms of seeking out those who are certainly movers and shakers within their own organizations, within the Gorilla, who are entrepreneurial of nature. And I'm thinking of somebody as I speak here, because there was a project that we did for a very entrepreneurial person, an entrepreneur in a very large business that we were dealing with. And he went out on a limb and he approached us. It was a challenge that he couldn't solve internally, and he sought to lean on us. And it actually spurned a separate company, a company that went on to become a kind of 15 million revenue company and a leader in its market in the UK. It's the company that we created as a result of this guy's entrepreneurialism. He went on to receive a gold star award within his own company as a result of his efforts, and the project was lauded right across the business. He did go out on a limb, but essentially our approach was to make him a star. So, how do we become star makers and not be the star? How do we amplify his credibility within the organization as a result of a very successful project? So I love that you've called that out. Getting into the where then, Shameen, what provide the context for this? Where should we be seeking these gorillas, and ultimately where should these gorilla relationships take us?
Right. So I suppose the way I've written it in the book is from the perspective of the gorilla. A gorilla like Microsoft has the advantage of engaging different parts of the world. And so my advice to them would be recognize the ways in which you need to adjust what you're doing in different parts of the world. For example, in advanced markets compared to emerging markets. But also be conscious of what you can learn from different parts of the world. So for example, Israel is where a lot of interesting startup partnering practices emerged for Microsoft, thanks to a very intrapreneurial guy there called Zach Weisfeld. And he's now sort of replicating his success in Intel. And so that's the broad idea from the point of view of the big company. But from the smaller company's point of view, well, small companies typically start locally somewhere. And to the extent that their scaling with purpose includes the prospect of going international.
And I assert that you should think beyond your existing borders. I feel you cannot scale effectively if you haven't the mindset to scale beyond your existing borders. So we're both aligned on this.
Very good. So then what we're talking about is exactly how I came into this topic, which was I was looking at how small companies were internationalizing. I came to realize that leveraging network relationships were important, and a subset of them were beginning to talk to big companies with the hope of tapping into the global footprint of the gorilla. And so when you flip it around from the point of view of the smaller company, and you basically tap opportunities in other parts of the world, I would say it's important to recognize two things. One is the sort of the macro environment. And I think, at a very broad level, you can think of differences between advanced markets and emerging markets. So if you were like a small company in Belfast, for example, there could be opportunities in tapping the network of a big company, let's say in Canada or in Sweden. And well, that would be one way to expand. But it could also be that the case that, you know, this the big gorilla you're engaging with has a significant presence in Asia, and entering the Asian market through that partnership can be one way in which to reach a market that is not easy to deal with, but you sort of benefit from the footprint that the bigger company has there. So I think recognizing the potential for differences in the different kinds of markets, and then learning to adapt. And again, the role of the big company can potentially be useful. But the other is also to think more broadly of the big company's ecosystem or its partner network. And so it may not be the gorilla itself that you're partnering with in Asia. It could be an Asian partner of the same gorilla. And I think companies vary wildly on this, but a company like Microsoft, for example, used to have this event that they called the Worldwide Partner Conference. I think they rebranded it, but the idea was that they bring together partners from different parts of the world. And so I have seen small companies from one part of the world finding their resellers and distributors for another market at those events. And what they share in common is they are fellow partners of Microsoft, which means they tend to have a certain level of technical compatibility, but also a certain level of compatibility of values and ethos and orientation. And then that becomes the basis for their internationalization. And so that goes very much into the extending part of the relationship. But then, you know, part of this is really about learning. So the key observation I made about internationalization of small companies is that their speed of internationalization is a function of their speed of learning, in terms of learning about the differences in different parts of the world, learning how to internationalize. And I think partnering with a gorilla, partnering within the wider ecosystem of the gorilla, that can be very helpful.
In the spirit of partnerships, I found it incredible that 193 countries of almost 200 countries globally signed the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. You know, when you think of all of the things that countries disagree on, we had, you know, unanimous collaboration around the 17 UN SDGs. Can you, before we move into our close, can you speak to the context of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? And maybe just before you do that, remind our listeners again of what those UN SDGs are. We've had some wonderful speakers who have spoken directly to the United Nations SDGs, the likes of Marga Hoek, Miriam Sidibe, two wonderful ladies who are really pioneering in the context of evangelizing about the UN SDGs and the importance of aligning purpose to the UN SDGs to scale with purpose. So can you just remind our listeners again of what the UN SDGs are, and then their context in relation to the Dancing with Gorillas? And
sure. Absolutely. So in September 2015, at the United Nations General Assembly, which tends to happen in the last week of September, 17 Sustainable Development Goals were adopted as this global agenda to be achieved over the next 15 years. So from 2015 to 2030, there were 17 goals that all of these countries signed up to, and each of these goals had certain targets and indicators. And the first of these is basically about eradicating poverty. The next is about hunger. The third one is about health. The fourth is about education. The fifth is about gender equality, so on. And the 17th of the 17 is partnerships for the goals. Now, there's a history to this, which is in 2000, when Kofi Annan, the Ghanaian diplomat, was United Nations Secretary General. 8 Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, were adopted. Again, not terribly dissimilar from the ones I just mentioned, to be achieved within 15 years. So from 2000 to 2015. But as 2015 was approaching, it was very clear that the Millennium Development Goals would not be achieved. But more importantly, those 8 goals have been sort of decided in a very top-down way. It was seen as mainly the agenda of developing countries. And so as 2015 was looming ahead, it may have been Ban Ki-moon, the Korean Secretary General, who created a committee. And I think there were 3 heads of nation, if I remember correctly, one from Africa, one from Asia, one from Europe, who was David Cameron at the time. And they basically had a much broader consultation process. And the 8 became 17, but it was seen as everybody's sort of business, not just the developing countries. And it included climate. So SDG 13 is climate action. But when they adopted these 17 goals in September 2015, there was an asterisk against that, and it said it will be sort of ratified in Paris, which went on to happen, the Paris Treaty for Climate Change. So this was it. The honest truth is, there is nothing very clever about the 17 goals. It's basically things that have been problems for a long time. But the genius of this was it was agreed upon by everybody. There was a global agenda, and I think what was also very much part of the story was it was clear that while government was important, and while civil society, non-profits, NGOs, etc., were important, these 2 arms of society alone could not achieve these SDGs. And so business would have an important role to play whilst pursuing profit. So, we would have, there was always going to be a place for charity, philanthropy, and so on. But how could business pursue opportunities that would also help to deliver on the SDGs? And so I think that was very exciting to me as a business school academic. By now, I had sort of spent a decade since having graduated with my PhD. But also, I'd moved to this school in Shanghai, the China-Europe International Business School, where I'm based. It's a joint venture of the European Union and the Chinese government. And they had established a campus in Accra, Ghana, a few years before. And I started going to Ghana to teach and also to do research. And I, of course, in terms of research, I began looking for examples of smaller companies partnering with big companies. And there I found the term social entrepreneurship was redundant. All entrepreneurship was social. So the entrepreneurs were saying, well, we don't have regular power supply, and so we're starting the solar business to address this, but they were seeking to do it at profit. Or they would say, it's very difficult to get bank loans, and so we're starting this microfinance company to make a profit, but it was solving a social issue as well. And big companies like Microsoft, which had already identified Africa as a big, as sort of a frontier market, as sort of the next big thing for the future, were already investing in capacity building and so on. And they made it very clear to me, this ain't CSR. This is us developing the market for the future. And so that then resulted in big companies like Microsoft, also Unilever, very sort of actively started engaging with social enterprises. And I found that this could be construed of as being part of SDG 17, Partnerships for the Goals, which in the formal documentation is mostly about governments partnering with governments, partnering with NGOs, whatever. I think this was very much about business and very dissimilar types of businesses coming together to achieve value for each other, but also a societal benefit. So the way I see that piece is, it's not just a win-win, it's a win-win-win for the big company, for the small company, and for society.
Hear, hear. I am conscious of time. I'm conscious of keeping you up. We should have planned a two-parter, Shameen. There's so much in this. I want to just quickly touch on mindsets because you reference this in your book, and beyond that, then anything you feel that we haven't addressed that you feel is important in the context of our SME leaders in relation to partnering, and then we'll move into our close.
It's well past 10 o'clock at my end, but I'm so energized today. First of all, I'm thoroughly enjoying our conversation.
Thank you. Likewise.
But also today was the 6th session of an elective I teach my MBA students on corporate startup partnering, and it's essentially modeled on the book. So each session is a chapter, and today's session was the SDG 1. Yeah. And I had a guy from Ghana wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and Zoom in, and he founded a company called BISA, which is the word BISA means ask in the Twi language, and it allows people to ask questions about health issues to medical professions through an app. And this was actually created in 2014 when Ebola was a concern. Unfortunately, many people in places like Liberia lost their lives. Ghana was spared, but he got this thing in place. And then a couple of years later, got selected to work with Bayer through the Bayer initiative to work with small entrepreneurial firms. And then fast forward to 2020, when COVID hit, it was like they had been built for a problem like this. And so he talked to the students, and then somebody from Bayer also made a presentation. Brilliant. And so, my heart is full. But I think what that example, and indeed, several of the things that we've been talking about, what I think they reflect is at a much broader level, 3 key mindsets: the entrepreneurial mindset, a collaborative mindset, and a global mindset. So the entrepreneurial mindset is really about 3 things, which research continuously throws up as being dimensions of entrepreneurial orientation: proactiveness, innovativeness, and risk-taking. And the innovativeness, being innovative is a broad term here, not just about technological innovation. It's just about being creative. It's about thinking outside of the box, finding ways to keep things moving when a relationship is appearing to be stuck. And the risk-taking piece is accept that there is no guarantee of success, but manage the risk. So that's the first piece. And I love the way you had referred to this entrepreneurial guy within the company who got the gold star. So that cuts both ways, right? And it's a division of entrepreneurial labor. So small companies need to realize that not every big gorilla is going to be a suitable partner. But when they have an entrepreneurial mindset and the big company does, then that's very important to establishing the prospect of working together. But what you definitely need to make it happen is the second mindset, which is the collaborative mindset. And I think of this as, leveraging networks if actively as opposed to really, but also discerningly. The network relationships are good for different things, and reflectively, in the sense of constantly adopting a learning perspective. What can I learn through this relationship, either about the company or about relationship building itself, or about something to do with the technical expertise that the company needs. And the final piece is the global mindset, which is more about curiosity, competence of how to deal with other cultures, putting yourself in the other person's shoes, looking beyond your nose, and having connections, reaching out and actively cultivating this global network as well. And even as an educator, I find that these are good mindsets to encourage students, young people, to develop, to be entrepreneurial, collaborative, and global. And I still insist on the global, even at a time when geopolitical tensions are rampant, and it's very tempting to look inwards, and you can perfectly understand that instinct. And paying attention to problems at home are very, very important. And I don't see at all a contradiction to having a global mindset. But the fact of the matter is, we have global issues to deal with. Climate change isn't confined to one part of the world. Health crises are not confined to one part of the world. And so,
as we've seen with COVID didn't know any
absolutely.
barriers. Yeah, any borders.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. So it's the entrepreneurial mindset. And I think that speaks very much to the why, the collaborative mindset to the how, and the global mindset to the where.
I'm so glad I encouraged you to stay up and pose that question, because it speaks directly to our first principle of our 10 principle Scale Act framework, which is psyche. And you've described the mindset of the scaling entrepreneur beautifully in terms of it, the mindset being entrepreneurial, collaborative, and global. And that that becomes a multiplier of the efficacy of all of the other 9 principles, including, of course, partnering, because you're never going to seek out a gorilla to dance with if you have not got a global mindset. So in closing, first of all, is there anything else that you feel we haven't addressed that you would like to bring forward, Shameen, in the context of partnering?
I mean, I think I would just say that partnering is probably more art than science. Yeah. You know, when all has been said and done, you know, not everything is within one's control. And I think you've got to gauge success sort of over a period of time and across a portfolio of collaborations, which isn't easy, especially for small companies which have short-term survival needs and so on. But in the end, I think, you know, especially for small company leaders who take the long view, you know, patience is probably a big part of the story.
Yes, indeed. It's a big part of life, I feel, as well as the story of partnering. In the corporate context, I've enjoyed the conversation thoroughly. It's been a real pleasure to host you on the show today. I always close by posing this question to our guests. I mean, you've had such a rich, colorful career to date, and you look like a guy in your 20s. I can't believe the extent of your career and your experience and knowledge and wisdom in this subject matter. You've traveled extensively. You truly have this global mindset. Can you leave our listeners today with 3 timeless takeaways? You
know, for me, the key takeaways are actually around those 3 mindsets. You know, it is sort of be entrepreneurial, be collaborative, and be globally minded. And, you know, that can sound kind of trite. But I think the point is that these apply to much more than dealing with business or dealing with, you know, the partnering sort of things. You know, you take a step back and you look at people you admire and people who have made a difference. I mean, you mentioned, you know, the Italian equivalent and, you know, the genius of Da Vinci. And, you know, so many, you know, think of Mother Teresa. It's nothing to do with business, but everything she did, it was proactive, innovative, and involved some risk. I mean, you could argue that that was being entrepreneurial, but then she also got a lot of different people to help, one of whom, very interesting guy, was a heart surgeon who has gone on to create this heart hospital in Bangalore, a place that you know, which has adopted principles of the assembly line to try to make heart surgery affordable to the common person. You know, so obviously she was collaborating with all kinds of people, but with a very global perspective, right? An Albanian nun who took Indian citizenship, served in India, but then you had this group that's serving around the world. And so for me, these mindsets, which you said are critical to the psyche and the first principle that you talk about, for me, they are timeless takeaways, not just in terms of having mindsets to be effective in the business world, but I think, and I hope this isn't over the top, but I think a good way to try to live.
Hear, hear. What a beautiful way to end. We're absolutely aligned on that. Shameen, once again, congratulations on your wonderful book, Gorillas Can Dance, Lessons from Microsoft and Other Corporations on Partnering with Startups. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you on the show today. I have really enjoyed your wonderful energy, your wisdom, your experience. Can you share with our listeners what's next for you and how best to connect with you? They'll undoubtedly be keen to learn more.
Well, first of all, can I just say it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you. It's been a great opportunity for me to share some thoughts. And, you know, it's been 3 years since I've traveled outside of China as a result of COVID. I'm going, that will change next month. But this is thanks to technology and podcasts, wonderful podcasts like this, it's still possible to connect with a wide audience. So thank you for this opportunity.
You're welcome.
So there's more information on www.gorillascandance.com. I'm also accessible on LinkedIn. And well, what's next, I hope, is a sequel that builds on this, the last part of our conversation around SDGs and so on. I think digitalization was the big disruptive factor that led to the various collaborations I was studying. But I think sustainability has a similar effect at the moment, the need for green technologies and so on. I think one of the things Ukraine did is actually to accelerate that process, tragic though that situation is. But digital is also sort of now accelerating. I think that combination of digital and sustainability in terms of driving collaborations. So that's what I hope will be the follow-up piece.
Brilliant. Well, I look forward to staying in touch, and hopefully you will agree to come back onto the show again in the future to discuss the sustainability and digitalization and how those two have come together to advance our SME listeners in the context of supporting them to scale with purpose. So, Shameen, take care.
Thank you so much, and more power to you. What you're doing is so worthwhile and important. So thank you for letting me have a small role to play in this.
Oh, thank you so much.